The author of the landmark Chicana Power, Contested Histories of Feminism in the Chicano Movement, as well as the co-editor of Chicana Movidas, New Narratives of Activism and Feminism in the Movement Era. She is co-editor of the critical Latinx Indigeneity special issue of Latino Studies and has organized the working group of the same name. She is a professor of Chicano Studies and Central American Studies and Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she is affiliated also with the LGBT Studies. She has co-created and co-directed the digital story platform Mapping Indigenous Los Angeles, and she's currently working on rematriating historical memory and seeding Indigenous social movements through the Mobile Indigenous Community Archive in collaboration with the activists. So much to say about her work and all of the incredible interventions that she's made, but for now, we get to listen to her as she talks about her book. Thank you so much.
Cristina. I'm going to stand up. I feel sleepy, so I'm going to stand up. Okay, I'm moving. Are you all, tech is great over there? Okay. Thank you to the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the staff, and Cristina for imagining this event and for the land acknowledgement. Yes, I also recognize the caretakers and relatives of this land, and the Chocheño Ohlone peoples, and I come as a Two-Spirit Thai Cherokee relative in this good way who lives and teaches on Tongva, unceded Tongva territory. So Scales of Resistance, Transborder Indigenous Women's Organizing is inspired by so many fellow travelers, luchadoras, let me give you this picture, who are now ancestors, including Nelis Palomo, Maylei Blackwell, Tatiana de la Tierra. These are friends and comrades who passed while I was working on this. Horacio Roque Ramirez. During the pandemic, numerous Native leaders, Indigenous leaders passed: Policarpo Cha, Irma Luna, and Marta Sanchez here. It's an offering in honor of the world we are building together and the future generations who will inherit it. So what I want to share in this book is the result of my participation and research accompanying Indigenous women's organizing efforts for the past 25 years, as Cristina mentioned. It draws from 70 oral histories that I conducted and more than 80 events I attended, including local, national, transborder, and transnational meetings, encuentros, marches, workshops, and shared projects. This project's path has been guided by community-based activist research, and research undertaken this way opens a journey and creates rich connections, relationships, and commitments, all of which have taken me on unforeseen paths I could never have imagined when I set out. In this way, the research processes at the center of this book are rivers that pass through and shape much of my adult life. Because I started this when I was like 3, right? Just kidding. I've been doing this my whole adult life, basically. So what I want to share or attempt to weave here today is this journey of accompaniment, and to illustrate some of the ideas of interweaving scale and what I call geographies of difference in different chapters. To give you an idea of the scope of the book, Scales of Resistance shows how Indigenous women activists developed a strategy of weaving in and between multiple scales of power across local, national, and continental scales. So starting off, for example, in Chapter 1, Indigenous women and the National Coordinator of Indigenous Women, or the Coordinadora Nacional de Mujeres Indígenas, CONAMI, wove between translocal scales and the continental to make the national scale after the Zapatista Rebellion. In Chapter 2, so these kinds of activism create new spaces of participation and new forms of consciousness, and how their organizing conjures new scales, not just stays at colonial scales, and reimagines and rethinks scale. For example, in Chapter 2, Indigenous women organizers from Mexico helped build an advocacy network across Abya Yala, the concept of the Kuna people of Colombia and Panama, that concept's used by activists and Indigenous thinkers to rethink idea of an indigenous scale of interconnection and responsibility to land. The book also explores not only the ways Indigenous women scaled up their own cosmovisions to national and transnational or transborder scales, but the ways they regrounded this activism and localized it in their own pueblos, indigenous municipalities and territories in chapter 3. So I look at largely Guerrero and Oaxaca in chapter 3. It then joins the organizing of the migrant stream and building the kind of translocal way of being and belonging that formed the indigenous transborder scale of cultural continuity and political mobilization amongst Zapotecs and Mixtecs from Oaxaca, along with members of the Latin American indigenous diaspora who spatialized geographies of indigeneity on unceded territories of the Tongva and Cabraleño people in chapter 5, which include the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. My research ultimately challenges the ways migration scholars reproduce a settler colonial logic of terra nullius when they act as if migrants are not arriving on indigenous homelands. So the insights I share then are part of this collective knowledge formed through the experience of many indigenous women activists and several generations of organizers across different communities and multiple scales. In the intro, I do some work decolonizing scale and talking about pre-colonial spatial organization. I'm just going to skip that. And just let you know that the project that I'm talking about today highlights the way organizers collaborated across scale, both those made by indigenous epistemologies of land, practices of solidarity, and pluriversal concepts of spatial relationships. The project illustrates how indigenous women activists in Mexico and in its diaspora scale vertically up and down, but also horizontally, connecting locales, territories, and regions. I show how indigenous organizers interweave different types of scale that include the formal Western political arena or hegemonic spaces and discourses, as well as indigenous scales, spatial practices, and knowledges. So the strategic movement in and between scales is a form of interweaving that blends various ideologies and standpoints, and according to Cherokee Two-Spirit poet and playwright Coley Driscoll, interweaves epistemologies that create a third space. So that's the idea of interweaving scale. The second concept I want to introduce is the idea of, rather than exploring a fixed set of demands and strategies or identities that are scaled up in one direction or another, what I found was that indigenous women activists and social movements traverse and navigate vastly different terrains of power at each scale. So that's what I've been calling geographies of difference. This is important because the early literature on transnational social movements tended to focus on how marginal groups scale up to the global arena to create pressure and then leverage their demands back down to the national level. That's kind of the political science literature and international development literature. But what many fail to acknowledge, however, is that marginal actors have to navigate relationships of power that disenfranchise them in order to scale up. Indeed, most theories of transnational organizing don't account for how intersectional entrapments of power are configured and exerted differentially at each scale and across scales. So I had to learn to be attentive to how, even within differential relations and flows of power that constitutes network scales of activism, not only is power configured differently between scales, but social movement actors are differently situated by these power configurations within each scale. So across the scales and within each scale is how these geographies of difference work. Further, based on decades of work accompanying indigenous transborder, other activists, transnational activists, queer activists, feminist activists, I created the concept of geographies of difference to account for the ways different transborder political actors are situated at this intersection of race, indigeneity, gender, sexuality, citizenship status differently as they cross borders. So this centers the complex and creative ways differently situated transborder actors navigate power in between scales. Ultimately, this book tells the story of how organized indigenous women were able to revitalize and in some cases redefine women's role in community decision making, and create discourses that address women's rights within an Indigenous rights framework. Indigenous women activists began conversations about their own cosmovisions and gendered nature of social organization in their own communities, leading some to decolonize gender hierarchies and identities, and others to argue that Indigenous women are at the heart of family and community structures and therefore are at the heart of Indigenous resistance and autonomy. Although my work wasn't initially part of this spatial turn, because Indigenous women organizers I work with weave in and between these local, national, transborder, transnational, and land-based scales of power to create new scales of participation, I began to decolonize social geography's concept of scale to describe how they use these nodes of power. To give you a sense of the scope of scales of resistance, these include scales that are created by Indigenous women's organizing at the local and pueblo, or town or / village. Pueblo means people and village, so we tend not to translate that word because the people and the place go together. The municipal level and across Indigenous regions or territories. That might include several pueblos, municipalities, and settler colonial juridical borders, right? So there's Indigenous territories that are split by like the US-Mexico border, for example. It analyzes how their organizing creates scales of resistance across conceptualizations of scale. These concepts of scale include settler nations, states, geopolitical regions like Latin America or the Caribbean, across the hemisphere, transnationally or internationally at the United Nations, and across trans-Indigenous scales like Abya-Yala. Finally, the project includes the transborder scale, produced by the way Indigenous migrants build local and transborder lives and politics with such density that some scholars have called them transregions. So I rework Lynn Stevens' concept of transborder because that allows me to denaturalize colonial borders. So I tend to use transborder rather than transnational because I want to recognize that many Indigenous peoples see themselves in what should be called nation-to-nation relationships rather than as racial minorities, which are generally basically different colonial management systems between Mexico and the United States. So let me get into some of the work of the chapters. In chapter 1, I want to illustrate how Indigenous women moved up and down and across scale to build the National Coordinator of Indigenous Women. In this journey of accompaniment, I started in 1997. This is a young Marta Sanchez, an Amusca activist from the state of Guerrero. She comes from the Costa Chica, and she was part of the 500 años de resistencia indígena, negro y popular, right? So the way the movement was framed around 1992 in Guerrero was a Black, Indigenous, and popular resistance. And so when I began doing my research, you can tell I didn't have that great of a camera, but I actually was more comfortable being an activist than a researcher. And so I just kind of fell in. When I would go to events, I fell in with women the same age of the younger generation of activists that included Marta Sanchez and Candida Jimenez. They're on the right. There were also an older generation like Sofia Robles, who I'll mention in chapter 3 a little bit more. Both of those women are Mije scholars. So you can see in this 1999 workshop, there was a lot of discussion about autonomy, which is the framework of analysis and political struggle that emerged out of the Chiapas uprising. And after the uprising in 1994, new political spaces for Indigenous women and increased social movement networking were happening not only between various regions of Mexico, but across different kinds of sectors and movements and scales of organizing across the globe. Indigenous women, one of the most marginalized sectors in Mexican society, effectively learned how to move within limited social and political spaces to create new forms of identity and social meaning in those crevices and discourses that excluded them. Out of the most restrictive locations, activists developed this political skill of moving in between different scales of power, representation and negotiation, and in turn, reconfigured power at these scales, turning them into scales of resistance. So this is why I started thinking about scale, because I would watch them when they would be blocked at the national, they would move to the continental and then host the continental network to pressure the national. I watched as Indigenous women in this time period networked horizontally across translocalities and Indigenous regions within Mexico to build their national network. But I also saw how they began to weave scales of power, not just horizontally, but vertically, to influence and organize and pressure like men in the movement. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But impressively, they also grounded autonomy into, or scaled it down into their own lives and bodies and communities and families. So Indigenous women activists came together through this process of consulta, or grassroots deliberative processes, to talk about what is Indigenous autonomy. And they were talking about usos y costumbres, right, customary law. What do we like that works in customary law? What do we don't like? And so instead of the men of the movement who saw Indigenous rights as a political discourse to engage the state, they started like opening the hood and taking it apart and saying, oh, well, we like, the practice of autonomy. They started to scale it down to include forms of embodiment, their own lived realities and traditions of dress, like wearing huipil, weaving, medicinal knowledge. The practice of autonomy at the scale of the body and the family allowed them to women to start claiming their own bodily autonomy, such as the right to decide if and when to bear children and how many, and whom to partner with, and how to live a life free of violence. Tying these practices to a formal political claim of Indigenous autonomy has led to a more profound transformation of community life and Indigenous world-making that has sustained the movement in times of demobilization and selective neoliberal incorporation, state repression, and state incalcitrance, right? So this is a time period where the government negotiated with the Zapatistas. They were going to take the San Andres Peace Accords. Then they reneged on them, right? And then after they reneged, if you see the flow of the book, many people moved down into the statewide networks, which I'll talk about in the next few chapters. But scaling down to the intimate scales of body, home, community, they transformed Indigenous autonomy not to be just a political discourse, but to be an embodied practice. And this was really important, right, as the state kept reneging on its promises for Indigenous autonomy. So they would do this by meeting in these little circles and putting what they liked and what they didn't like. And in 2001, I think it was 2000 or 2001, I attended the second National Encuentro of CONAMI in Chilpancingo and Guerrero. And I participated in small breakout sessions and sat with hundreds of Indigenous women activists in the plenaries in 2000. And I was moved by how they collectively forged a multifaceted, multi-scalar concept of autonomy, illustrated here in this part of the final declaration. Although Indigenous autonomy is a shared discursive and political terrain of struggle within the broader Indigenous movement in Mexico, women activists multiplied the meaning of autonomy beyond a rights discourse to a multi-scalar practice of Indigenous freedom and survival that has the potential to democratize and empower Indigenous women in their communities and in the world. So, of course, Indigenous women's proposals at the time were not well received by the Indigenous movement, the men in the movement. And that's how they began to navigate these geographies of difference, right? When they were blocked at the national level, they participated in both big national formations, the National Indigenous Congress, or the CNI, and ANIPA. And after they were blocked from holding a women's session for putting women's rights on the agenda, they built women's commissions, and then they built an alternative national scale through this network called CONAMI. And so what was interesting is that when they were blocked at that national level, the reason they formed CONAMI was to host the continental network of Indigenous women of Abyala. So just as weaving up and down and across scale is important to how organized Indigenous women in Mexico use the momentum of local movements to build the women's network within the national Indigenous movement, They even use these networks to demand women's formal leadership within those national organizations. So many of the members of CONAMI went on to lead ANIPA, they went on to lead CNE. And I argue they even led to the recent presidential candidacy of Marichui, Maria de Jesus Patricio. She was, I mean, the movement's brilliant because they didn't run a candidate, they ran a collective, the SIG, I forgot what they were called, like basically it was like a collective committee on indigenous governance, and she was the spokesperson. But Marichui was one of the first CONAMI members, right? So it's over the 20 years or plus years, you could see this scaling up and down eventually works, and women are leading and becoming the spokespeople for the movement. So the book reveals the important efficacy of being able to scale up or down, but across different types of scale, connecting political arenas to specifically gendered bodies, and contrasting the colonial division of scale with indigenous conceptions of scale, space, solidarity, and connection. And I take this up and looking at chapter 2, the Continental Network of Indigenous Women, or the ECMIA, which details how indigenous women activists from Mexico traveled to participate in the 1994 Latin American and Caribbean Regional Preparatory Meeting for the 4th World Conference in Beijing. They immediately dealt with mestiza racism and the stark power differentials at the heart of the concept of geographies of difference. And they had to overcome their own marginalization as indigenous women there when they were engaging those organizers. So they organized their first encuentro. They just decided, we're not going to wait for the feminists to represent us. They organized their first enlace, encuentro of the Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas in Quito in 1995. They organized themselves and they got their agenda presented in Beijing, but what happened is they continued to organize after. And this becomes really important because why Beijing wasn't important, and Beijing plus 10 and all the after meetings, the other process that was happening in the UN was the UN meeting, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous People, and all the negotiations around the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that was passed. So they used the call of the Cuna land episteme of Abya Yala. Indigenous women activists conjured the indigenous scale of connection, solidarity, and responsibility through the hemisphere by invoking, the first name was the Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas de Primeras Naciones de Abya Yala. So they were like putting Canadian phrasing of First Nations with Abya Yala. So they created this kind of scale of action that centered their own knowledges, needs, and cosmovisions. They used this indigenous scale of Abya Yala to generate their own alternative form of connection and organizing, and to counter colonial, regional, hemispheric, and continental names. So the chapter kind of goes through why, basically, if we keep referring to the Americas as Americas or Latin America, we continually reinforce a colonial reality, right? But it's really interesting kind of following Annette Singh's work, who calls attention to the important ways scales are produced by global capital and how they produce frictions and how they can fail. So what happened is this scale of Abya Yala, which is a scale of solidarity, eventually fails, right? In the sense that ECMIA finds that Abya Yala is unscalable as a way to both enter and resonate in the international system, right, of the Americas, the geopolitical system, and to accompany the great diversity of indigenous women from northern Canada all the way to Tierra del Fuego. And that's important because a lot of people think Abya Yala means Latin America, again, because we're colonized in the way we think. They mean the whole land base, like the United States is Abya Yala, Canada's Abya Yala, etc. Through indigenous women's organizing in what's now the Americas, they could not scale Abya Yala, but they kind of could cast a transborder imaginary that had the possibility of transcending colonial nation-state borders and creating forms of affinity and connection with indigenous women throughout the continent. So this interweaving of indigenous theorizing brings me to Marta Sanchez Nestor, who I showed you at the beginning, an Amusco activist and founding member of CONAMI, which she called the doble mirada, the double look between the feminist movement and the indigenous movement. This echoes Gloria Chacon, a Chorti literary scholar who theorizes Cabawil strategies. And Cabawil is that bird and that looks both ways, to the past and to the future at once. So indigenous women's activism then moves between indigenous knowledge systems and scales and shared political projects, as well as dominant and Western systems and scales, to form this double weave. And that's what Coley Driscoll, the Cherokee Two-Spirit scholar I was mentioning, theorizes as creating bridges between multiple knowledges, practices, and epistemologies. In fact, Coley theorizes this form of thinking from the Cherokee double woven basket. So if you've ever seen one, one has a face that faces outward, but inside is a different face, right? And they use this basket woven from river cane as a metaphor to talk about how queer and indigenous knowledges in Zir Esigi theory is a double woven knowledge system and interwoven epistemology that creates bridges between the two and a third space in between. So this is really interesting because it's interweaving concepts of Western hegemonic feminism with indigenous feminist struggles that demand decolonizations of concepts of gender and sexuality that are grounded in communal struggle within their families and communities not outside of them, right? So this kind of hits at one of the problematics of Western feminism that's grounded on individuals. And these are some of the photos of, I think Panya is from Peru, and this is Kalinsisk from the Winneman Wintu, right? The salmon run that's held up here with Rigoberta Menchú, and the Socorro Land Trust is here represented as well. So we got folks, the Ohlone folks in the house. But here's even a kind of funny interweaving and disruption of colonial knowledges. One of these conferences was held in Guatemala City, right? And all the conference rooms were named after conquistadors. And so you can see this Wi-Fi codes, they're like renaming every room, right? The Itza room was the former Francisco Pizarro room, right? The Colibri room was, a different colonizer. The Ixquic room was a different colonizer. The Gran Jaguar, right? So even you can see how they're reworking spaces. And this chapter goes on to kind of look at the first indigenous intervention in the feminist encuentros, the Latin American and Caribbean feminist encuentros. We were all there in 2005. This was one of the first ones to deal with diversity. There were no indigenous panels. We went to the only one, and this NGO, this Mestiza NGO worker was like, even though the grandeur of the, of the indigenous past, the Inca past, that basically started to then describe indigenous men with this kind of very racist brutality. And one by one, all these different women, these are leaders from the Brazilian Amazonian network, started to speak out, and we formed the first indigenous women's caucus within the feminist. So like there was the Ana Zagarifana activist, and there's 2 Maya women here and another woman from the Amazonian Women's Network. That's me with shorter hair. I think I was no, I wasn't. I had come up, I was 3, yeah. And this is us, again, with Martha Sanchez in the middle. And then they presented this at of course, the final declaration. This was the first indigenous declaration at the Feminist Congreso. And this was the 10th Encuentro Feminista, in Brazil. But did things change? Well, this is Mexico City, the very next Encuentro. It looks like a talk show stage. This is the room they gave the indigenous women activists. It had no lighting, no sound system, no microphone. That's, again, Marta Sanchez speaking. And this, again, is the indigenous women making their statement. But what's interesting here is there's a lot of indigenous migrant leaders. So Esther there in the orange on the very second to the end is a Triqui organizer from the San Quintin Valley of Baja California. So Oaxacan indigenous migrants are internal migrants to Mexico, as well as Odilia Sanchez Odilia Romero, who's one of the major activists in LA, Zapotec leaders. That's Margarita Gutierrez, who was one of the only indigenous women as part of the San Andres Peace Accords to negotiate with the government. So these are just, you can kind of see people in these different, this is the Northern Network of Indigenous women in the Continental Network. So the third chapter then goes into this idea of the groundedness of what happens when, you know, Indigenous women are blocked at the national level. They move down to struggle for their own labor, dignity, and well-being at the continental level. And they scaled it down into community care and economic well-being, into their homes and gardens. So I take a look at how Sofia Robles became the first woman municipal president in Tlahui in Oaxaca. And this chapter really rethinks the concept of comunalidad, right, which is a Zapotec, and, well, it's a Oaxacan indigenous concept and form of social thought that thinks about communitarian practices. So it includes Mijes, Zapotecs, and Mixtecs. But what's really interesting is that a lot of people didn't want me to touch this because at first the municipalities, so most of municipalities in Oaxaca are governed by indigenous normative law, but many women didn't have citizenship rights. And the reason they didn't have citizenship, so the state will then represent indigenous communities as more backwards than the rest of Mexico. But the reason why it was organized that way is because they were following laws that were imposed on ejidos by the state, right? So it was like a mestizo patriarchy that led to the way people were organizing. And so women have been organizing for a long time within their communities. But the system of tequio, the system of collective labor that allows you to move up, it's like a ladder. You have to move up to municipal president. What's tricky is that all the collective labor that women do for patron saints days, etc., and community labor, it's not counted, right? So what's counted is public labor that's male. So a lot of women didn't want to be, you know, have this other role, because then they would have two different collective labor jobs in addition to their, you know, household labor, etc. So I look at how, you know, basically Sofia Robles and several of these women start to challenge and work and articulate and become presidents of municipalities, and then organize at the scale of their own territory. So this is the first assembly of Mije or Ayuk women at the territory it just includes the territory of Ayuk folks. And the last chapters join the migrant stream. I look at this trans region, a scale conjured by indigenous mobility and indigenous community making or political organizing across this trans region that ties together nodes of the Oaxacan indigenous diaspora, right? So people migrate from Oaxaca to DF, to San Quintin, remember I just mentioned, in Baja California, to, you know, San Diego County, to farm workers. We know, I think 20 to 30% of all California farm workers are Oaxacan indigenous migrants or Oaxacan indigenous people. So this was part of a collaborative study that they asked me. I served as an advisor to the FIOB, but we had a collective project on basically how to develop binational indigenous leadership from Mexico, and because they don't use the word transnational, because Rufino Dominguez, who also passed away, and because he belongs to one of those cancer clusters in the Valley of California, right? So he's one of the people fighting for, you know, that indigenous people are the poorest of all farm workers, and they had to live on what was a former Exxon field. And so there was a lot of chemicals. And sadly, you know, he had a kind of cancer that was very common. But he's sitting here, Rufino Dominguez. So we had this study that was, you know, California, and we met in LA, and Tijuana for Baja California and Oaxaca, to kind of think about how to diversify their binational leadership in terms of including more women. And by ethnic diversity, that kind of uses the Mexican phrasing, but they mean to include Purépecha and Maya, etc. And youth. So through this study, folks started to organize. There I am taking notes in the very corner behind Odilia. This is Odilia Romero from LA and Mije, leader Maura. And so people, we did the study. They designed this Miel, Mujeres Indígenas en Liderazgo, and Indigenous youth started to organize correspondingly, and they basically got their own positions on the Binational Council. This organizing led to California having an all-women's representation, and it took many more years to get women to be a binational coordinator of the whole FIAB. It was really messy and hard. Odilia was nominated. She had a really hard time kind of holding the reins of power because of so much infighting. And she ultimately left the organization because after she stepped down, the next guy to be elected was a guy from the teachers, from the teachers union, who had been purged from the FIAB for sexual assault. And then he was invited back and now is the general coordinator. So Odilia left with her daughter and they formed Cielo, one of the most powerful current organizations organizing Indigenous migrants in LA. And so the last chapter looks at what it means to be an Indigenous migrant on Tongva territory. LA folks know LA by freeways. This is a freeway map. I love this because it's a freeway map of different Tongva villages. And so this chapter really looks at the spatial projects of both Maya and Zapotec communities. The migrating regions that end up in LA are largely from the Valles Centrales and from the Northern Sierra. And these communities, these regions get mapped onto LA regions. So whereas the Valles Centrales end up on the west side in Palms and Culver City, Koreatown, Westlake, and Pico Union ended up being the Northern Sierra. And so like I have students who are married and one's from the Valles Centrales, so they have to move from one side to other, even in their wedding, to represent both sides of the community. So I look at how different spatial projects of Indigenous belonging through labor, through spirituality, through culture, are re-spatialized in the Guelaguetza, in the Calinda, in Oaxaca. The Guelaguetza is pretty much a show for tourists, but in diaspora, it's how migrants teach their hometown. I think there's 26 different Philharmonic bands. Basically, the LA Phil is basically going to be all Oaxacan at some point, but there's 26 Philharmonic bands from the different pueblos of Oaxaca and dance troops. We covered this in Mapping Indigenous LA when we included it, the Latin American Indigenous diaspora. And so a lot of this, as I was working through this, kind of led me to another geography of difference, which is, the intersection or the multiple colonialities at play, both Spanish and Anglo or Spanish/Mexican. And so the working group that I work with we configured or coined this phrase, critical Latinx indigeneities, to try to dismantle some of the problems with mestizaje and the problems with indigenismo within our field in Latino studies. And I'll just wrap up by kind of mentioning that when I started writing the book, it was a really depressing time in the movement. And it was in a process of demobilization. And as I was writing, it takes like 10 years to write the thing. So the code is called the subterranean life of seeds. So below the surface, CONAMI was reorganizing itself. They decided to have a collective leadership structure to be more aligned with Indigenous governance. FIAB was having its own issues, but Cielo was born, right? And so, so they, it's kind of taking that slogan that lots of the families of Ayotzinapa used. They buried us, but they didn't know we were seeds, right? To the idea that is under the surface is also a scale of organizing. There's a lot of things I've kind of skipped over in terms of like in Oaxaca, Indigenous moms were organizing daughters, but in diaspora, there's Indigenous Oaxacan youth are bringing their moms into. So it's fun because there's several of my students whose moms were in the organizations. Realized I have a lot of the founding documents of both of these networks, and they're networks, so they don't have archives. So we've created this mobile Indigenous community archive, and we're at the kind of proof of of concept phase. But it's the idea that this could be a seed bank of movement knowledge that then gets rematriated back into the movement. And so youth are starting to work through the Youth Commission of CONAMI is starting to work with it. And also in the Ph.D, they're using their archive of the Tequio, which is the magazine, to relaunch the magazine. So this is something we're building together. And yeah, I'll end there. This is a Ph.D. They lost a lot of their collections because the domain expired and no one renewed it. So a lot of their archive was digital and they lost it. So we're trying to create an archive that's community controlled. And that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I couldn't even imagine the scope that you were able to cover in this presentation. This book is so rich, and every single section has so much to offer. So I highlight 3 things that really stick out to me as I was reading this book and sitting with it in preparation for this wonderful conversation. One is just to highlight the incredible theoretical work that Dr. Blackwell takes on in this work. And it's not just theory for the sake of theory, but it's weaving together and challenging all of the racialized, the gendered, colonial ways that theory has operated in the academy, right? Every single concept that Dr. Blackwell is using in her book is challenging the history of what this institution has been. And so I was thinking about how, Dr. Blackwell is describing what these women are doing in terms of like moving between scales horizontally and vertically. And I think theoretically there's a similar movement happening as Dr. Blackwell is moving across fields, transnational migration, feminist studies, Chicana history, which is some of her former work, to create theories that really do justice to the ways that these women are organizing and to the ways that they're challenging these different colonialities in their day-to-day life. And so I think these interventions really do create the new grammars and the new conversations that these these talks are named. But and I wanted to highlight that because through my work, I work with Maya Mom women activists, and I remember when I first came here, I was really frustrated because there wasn't enough theory to really name what they were doing and the scope and scale of their work and their interventions. And so the second thing I wanted to lift up and consider was how scale, in the way that Dr. Blackwell uses it, is not just a theoretical intervention, but it's a methodological one. In her book, Dr. Blackwell brings together what she was naming as Marxist, feminist, and indigenous understandings of space and social relations. And how scale, I'll quote her, she describes scale as, quote unquote, the levels through which power is organized and how activity is enacted and political interests articulated, contested, and negotiated produce those levels. Rather than fixed platforms for social activity and economic and political processes that connect up or down to other hierarchical levels, scales are instead outcomes of those activities and processes. And so when I started to think about this, I thought about how much of a gift this was for anyone studying activism. And she says this in her methodological notes in the introductory chapter, but how her work could be described as a multi-sided ethnography, but instead thinking about sites as places that are constituted through power and place, it allows us to open up where we can study and how we can do this research, so that it's not just going to one place and sticking there. If Dr. Blackwell had just stayed in one location, we wouldn't have been able to see the dense networks that these activists were creating. And so I was thinking about scale as a methodological intervention because then it opens up what she also calls the act of acompañamiento as a way of engaging research. And I was thinking about how that also shifts our responsibilities as researchers to think about if we are accompanying activists on this work, what does that ask of us? Instead of just being present in these spaces or listening and taking notes, what does thinking about scale and what does thinking about accompanying do to us in that space? What our responsibilities are to engage or react or step back. And so maybe I'll ask a question in a little bit about those politics. But it opened up the space for me to think about research as an act of solidarity and witnessing, rather than just kind of being there for the sake of thinking about theory. And lastly, maybe also to explain why we're in Berkeley Way West. As a student in the Department of Education, this is our building. And the third thing that I really want to highlight is all of the different ways that learning happens in this book, which was really incredible. I think Dr. Blackwell began her talk thinking about this metaphor of a river, and she described some of the ways that the women activists were blocked at different scales, at different organizations, and how this made them, like a river, kind of look for other ways of engaging and doing the work that they wanted to do. And for me, as a scholar in education, that made me think of the learning process. And so there's a really beautiful way that thinking about what these women are doing is also allowing us to see that activism is a space of learning in different ways. Different ways of strategizing. She also describes how their consciousness is changed through these different activist encuentros and activities. And so I see this learning and this unlearning as a humanizing, not to like center the human, but to center how research can also show change and struggle and hardship within activism as examples of humility and care and responsiveness to how the world is changing. So with all of that said, I'll move into the first question and then open it up for everyone else. But part of your work was bearing witness and analyzing solidarity across lines of difference. I wanted to ask how you think about the emergence of solidarity and the possibilities of solidarity, and how this connects to possibly the breakdowns that you're describing.
The breakdown.
Yeah, like Anna Singh's thinking about like unscalability. Mm-hmm. How you think about the intersection of how solidarity comes about, but also how it breaks.
Yeah, so that was important, the idea of what's unscalable, like in the sense that failure, like something ending isn't a failure per se, but it's a strategy that looks at, some activists and have orientations to what Sonia Alvarez calls like a policy advocacy logic, mm-hmm. Like they want to intervene in the UN. And then others have more of an identity solidarity logic, and so those two logics work together, right? Abya Yala is more of an identity solidarity logic, but it doesn't work so well in a geopolitical formation that is oriented towards the United Nations. Turn this on. Okay, thanks. I turned it off. Oh, sorry. And put this thing on too. Okay. What was I saying? Okay, so I was just answering the question without the microphone. It's like having myself muted on Zoom. And I was talking about how even what's seen as a failure when a scale folds in the possibility of organizing in the United Nations or the UN system, like in chapter 2, if Abya Yala can't function in the geopolitical arena of the Americas, because it's like organized as the Pacific, Africa, Asia, the Americas, right? But there's still a logic of solidarity and identity that's held within that. And I was referring to Sonia Alvarez's work about those activists who are very policy advocacy oriented, but they have to operate within a certain framework. And just because the scale of Abya Yala doesn't function or work in the same way, that doesn't mean that that other logic of solidarity isn't there and being called upon, right? Because you'll sit in a meeting and they'll have government functionaries talking about how good their government's doing on indigenous politics, and then the women will be like, what about feminicide? What about, because different activists, like one set of activists will be happy that they got the Ford Foundation in the room, and others would not care, they could care less, right? So sometimes those different logics collide and crash, but both are necessary to do those different political works. Yeah.
Thank you.
I wanted to comment on something you were saying about learning, because I was thinking about this. I was just thinking about this, the learning. This is more in chapter 4 about the Oaxacan and moms. I was noticing there were these mom-daughter teams, and because some of their men and families were in migration and they sent back remittances, girls got to stay in school through, they used to have to drop out, after, when they reached 12 or so. And so the girls got to stay in. And so on all the, there was this derecho de no migrar, right? The right to not migrate. And they were doing these productive projects. And the moms were basically the community organizers, but the daughters had the little notebooks and they were keeping track of everyone's money. And so where the moms couldn't access education, formal education, the daughters could. And so they teamed up in these really interesting ways. But yeah, on the U.S. side, it was the Oaxacan kids who got access to education. So they were bringing the moms and tias. And what was really interesting is so many Oaxacan indigenous women wanted to come get an education. And they really couldn't because they had to put their kids through school, and they were domestic workers. And so activism was the space for them to learn about human rights. Some made their husbands come to the women meetings, right? And it was really cool because then the whole family got to understand, indigenous rights, autonomy, human rights, all the different things. So it's like how those leadership schools became schools because they still couldn't access, community college because they were working 2 jobs, but they could, sometimes get there on a Saturday. And so they could access learning together. So, yeah. When you said that, that sparked this idea. I was like, yeah, learning.
Yeah.
Oh, and unlearning, because some of them took the decolonization workshops and were talking about how they refer to themselves as Oaxacan, but not necessarily as indigenous. And that they learn that they're indigenous in migration because of the racism of other mestizos, right? When you're all in Oaxaca, no one's saying hey, you Oaxaquito, but parents organize in Oxnard and stuff that they have an anti-hate speech campaign against calling their kids Oaxaquitos or little Indians. Yeah, so they learn about their indigenous identity because of the racism of other Latinos, right? So it's an interesting thing. So people want to say, oh, well, they didn't know they were indigenous before, but that category, no, they knew they were from a certain pueblo, right? That category, indigenous, is it's a pan-indigenous concept that people didn't really need before they were in the migrant stream. So it's interesting how, a lot of, in Native studies, indigeneity is tied to land, but in this case, indigenous consciousness was really tied to dislocation and mobility. Yeah. Wow. I'm just going to keep answering questions you're not asking me, because I'm like, oh yeah, that happened, and that was really interesting. But it was something you said that made me think about that.
No worries. Thank you so much. I actually wanted to open up to questions from the audience. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There are.
Hi, Raul. Hi. Oh, now you have to mic up.
I was really interested in the use of the language of of rights. It's through all of this and the different kinds of idioms, like the way you really clarified like the use of the pueblo and what pueblo means, and is it derecho that when you talk about derecho del pueblo, is it of the people or is it of the town? And the very long, I mean, it's something I'm interested in. There's a very long like political history, and I'm familiar with like the 18th and 19th century and the tensions around that, and even earlier with Franciscans and others who are like, no, you have a right to use the land but not own the land. And it's a debate there that unravels differently in that period. And so I'm just wondering what echoes we have for this period of like the tensions between human rights, for example, and rights of citizens versus rights of the people, not even people, but of pueblo, which seems to echo a lot more of what you were talking about with, and I'm going to get them, where are my notes here? With some of these organizations like you mentioned Marichu and Konami, the sense of the collective of advocating for rights for a collective, but not just of people, but of place and land as well. Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of like curious about the different idioms of like the language of rights and when they might bump up against one another.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, but at different scales, right? So initially, when Indigenous rights and Indigenous autonomy were being debated, there was a seeming contradiction between women's rights and Indigenous rights. So Indigenous rights are collective rights, and they were saying women's rights were individual rights, right? So a lot of the thinkers of this movement were like, well, that's bullshit, basically, because like you can't have full Indigenous rights without women having rights within that, and you can't have women's rights. Women can't be free unless Indigenous women are free. And so they would say, these are two faces of the same coin. But basically, they were calling like the Western juridical tradition on its own limitations by how these were pitted against each other. And this gets out, there was this wild set of literature, like one book called Does Multiculturalism Menace like Women, right? Like does collective rights basically hurt women? But if you look at the literature like on customary law from India, the South Asian context, like basically these are laws that were set up by the British. And customary law, a scholar in Oaxaca, a historian, Zapotec scholar Luis Sanchez Lopez is doing this really amazing work on basically how Indigenous people get like connected to what he calls settler colonialism, which is a kind of newer concept in Mexico, but through the use of using customary law, right? This was like the trade-off. Like you get this bounded scale of autonomy, but you can't, So I think this is really interesting because then at the level of the pueblo, like it's not like other places of belonging. Like you have citizenship in your pueblo because you do the collective work, because you do tequio. So there's all these registers of meaning. Like you could live in the pueblo, but to have the right to own land and the right to citizenship, you have to do tequio. And then if you're a migrant, you have to send someone back to do it, or you have to go back to do it. Right? So there's all these interesting things that are now being renegotiated in migration. And then when we put kind of the gendered lens and the ideas of comunalidad, like women are already doing collective labor. They're just not doing it in a way that was state recognized. So kind of unpacking like how some Indigenous autonomy and governance comes from mestizo state imposition, right? Or how they negotiated their own limited freedom within that. So yeah, it's these layers I think that you're working with too, is that the history changes, but yeah, it's fascinating because then they, like in Oaxaca, they're like, oh, Oaxaca, Indigenous people are more backwards in terms of gender. And this, you could see this in the Zapatista uprising, like part of the, at first when the uprising happened, they're like, this can't be an Indian uprising because it happened early in the morning. Like kind of crazy racism, like Indios don't get up early in the morning, they're lazy, because it happened like on a holiday, like, January 1st. But the other reason besides that crazy racist logic was a kind of gendered logic of racism, which was this can't be, oh, they said, these are Guatemalan revolutionaries. These aren't our Indians, in Chiapas. But they said the other reason this can't be an indigenous uprising is because there was a women's rights agenda in the women's law, the women's revolutionary law, that passed even before the uprising became public. And so there's this kind of dual logic of racism of the state, where it's like, this can't be indigenous because it has a feminist leaning in it. And then when they tried to pass the federal constitutional change, they said, oh, we can't grant indigenous people rights because you don't protect the rights of women, right? So it's like this double whammy, like, you can't be truly indigenous if you have feminist leaning laws, and we can't pass your right to rule yourself. So because you don't protect the rights of women. So I started to look at how indigenous autonomy was really being ruled, or there was a kind of sense of governmentality that was based on gender. Like, we can control who's indigenous, who's authentically indigenous, and who can have rights as indigenous people by controlling discourses of gender, right? And so this is really fascinating. Like, how does gender become the discourse of governmentality in the neoliberal sense, like, of who can have rights in the neoliberal state? I went way around your topic question, but that's what I was thinking about. Yeah, thanks, Raul.
Maybe we can have one more question.
Because I'm so long-winded. I had this matcha. I got up at 4 a.m. and now I've had a little bit of caffeine, so I'm really thinking about this. Hi, Patricia.
Fabulous. When you talk about all these different scales and work across scales, also geographies of difference, it seems to me that there's also a temporality to these scales that maps onto calendrical notions of like the year or the ninth encuentro, right? But there is some other way of understanding indigenous time and indigenous activism as having these other scales. And I know that in your most recent article you talk about time. I just wanted to see if what's the scale of time? What are the times? Do time scales overlap in the scales that you were discussing in the book? That's it.
Thank you, Patricia. Blowing my mind. Yeah. Do different scales have temporality? Definitely. So I just published a piece called Indian Time. But basically how when indigenous declarations happen, they refer to time immemorial, right? So to be in Indian politics or indigenous politics is to be in time politics, right? To assert a firstness. But I was trying to figure out how, like, basically indigenous migrant women are navigating the different temporalities of scale, right? And this first occurred to me when I told the story of the Miel, the Women's Leadership Program. So when the California slate of women accepted their roles, they all accepted in their native languages. So they accepted in Mixteco, in Zapoteco, in Triqui. And one of the women activists from Oaxaca I was working with, she was like stunned. How could they be mujeres modernas and language speakers, right? So because to her, like, they had gone to get their education. So one was a doctoral student, several migrant, the head of the Oaxacan, the nonprofit arm of the FIAB has a Ph.D. in education, right? So for her, she couldn't balance those two temporalities. How do you be moderna, a modern woman, and an indigenous speaker? And to me, it was like so interesting how the nation of Mexico is imploded on these temporal nodes that always cast indigenous people in the past, right? So it's like pre-conquest, conquest, independence, revolution, what, you know, like modernity. But what's modern is not indigenous, and how indigenous, how temporality is cast onto indigenous women's labor. So if you go into Oaxaca, like it's very valued because people still grind the corn, and that takes so much time. But because you're grinding the corn and grinding the mole and grinding all the spices, I mean, it takes forever. I would laugh because sometimes if I would get hit on in the field and people would be like, will you marry me? I was like, you're going to starve because I can't get up at like 3 a.m. and start grinding that. But it's a kind of temporality of embodiment and labor. So somehow indigenous women are in the past because of this this ancient technology of grinding. Even though if moms and tias have kids in migration, then they just use a grinder, a mechanized grinder. But how? Yeah, I was just thinking like there's the scale of the milpa and the time of the milpa. There's the time of the pueblo, and then somehow if women migrate, they're seen as modern, right? Because they're urban. So just those conflicting temporalities that indigenous women activists are navigating. So I think different scales get ascribed time, but people do talk about like pueblo time, like time slows down because you can't get internet connection, because you're not, like time slows down because you're grinding corn. So yeah, I just tell some stories from my field work of like learning how to make totopos with some tias and moms. But like the girls were interested because I had a video camera, so they were like literally sitting on my lap to try to film it with me. But then the moms were like, so do you want to learn how to make totopos? And they're like, no. Like, they didn't want to be in what they sense was like drudgery, or like, so how the labor of indigenous women's, what are celebrated as like sovereignty, like food sovereignty, foodways, etc., really rely on this labor. And then in migration, that labor of making those culinary, Oaxaqueño food is why they have a side hustle. I mean, these women are the entrepreneurs. They own houses. They put their kids through college because of that hustle of the old foodways, but in this new context. So I just talk about, that kind of like it's old and new, but it's colonial time and indigenous time, and how migration speeds up time and shrinks time and space. We could get into like all these YouTube, like everything in the hometown association, is on like, everything happens on YouTube or language classes, or, it's like everything is someone needs to write about the digital scales and digital temporalities. But yeah, thank you, Patricia, for the question. Yeah. Oh, I think there's one more question. Can we take it? Yeah. Okay. I'll answer shorter. I'll try to.
I could listen all night, but I don't have a question, but just that your work is amazing, and I'm a congratulations.
Thanks. What's your name?
Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
But I'm actually on
Cool. Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's a really important, your study is really important because the literature that exists, so you might know my student Brenda Nicolas, who's a professor at UC Irvine, she wrote her master's thesis actually on Oaxacan youth organizing. So China, yeah. But like most people don't write on youth activism in LA and in Oaxaca. So Yeah. Are you working on like hometown associations, or how are you framing it? Mm. Cool. Uh-huh. Mika? Uh-huh. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. I love it. You're the next generation. We'll be at your book talk soon. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.